What's good, Duelists? We are back once again doing competitive tier list content. I was really surprised about the reaction to the previous tier list. I finished that video, sent it to Vlad, and said, see if you can find something in here that's actually watchable, and went back and forth about 15 times on if it was actually worth uploading or not, but he polished a diamond out of that rough. Let's see if we can do the same thing again. So last time the tier list wasn't particularly predictive. That's because we had a ton of tournaments under the existing ban list and with the existing card pool for me to just pull my opinions from. This time we're going to try and make some content that's actually prescient, and I will attempt to predict what will be good in an upcoming format. I'm really just staking my claim so in 2 weeks you all can come back here and tell me how stupid I was. Anyway, here's what I expect to be good in a post-ban list environment. And we're going to start with the best deck in the format. You know it well by now. It is, of course, the one, the only Kashtira. It's still Kashtira. I hate to be the one to probably have to deliver this information to you, but I think that the #1 deck is probably still Kash. Yes, it of course did lose 2 additional copies of Arise Heart. Yes, it also lost the ability to 9 Zone Lock with the Ablosis, but no, its core gameplay functionality didn't really change. No one was really 9 Zone Locking anyway with this deck anymore. The only decks that it had sort of utility against was Super Heavy Samurai, in which you could very easily, without much investment, lock the 2 Pendulum Zones and prevent a Waka Ushi from resolving. So that part of the game plan wasn't really something they lost. You know, it was already something they weren't considering. Just making a couple of guys in a Rise Heart was usually enough to steal games, and you can still do that. The Rise Heart is a little less centralizing because you can only do it the one time, but it's still going to be very good. And Kashtira's in this weird position now where people were making main deck concessions based on that deck's popularity, especially within top cuts. So if the deck gets less good and they have to prepare for a more diverse metagame, Kashtira Rise Heart may have less of a target on his head and might even get better. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen, but I do think that this deck, despite losing a little bit of repeatability and a little bit of consistency, is still far and away the best thing you can be playing in this upcoming format. Second up is the #1 deck that moved the most, I believe, as a result of this one. It is Sprite, which I am confidently putting in tier 1. So Sprite is in a very weird position. If you talk to pro players, literally all of them think that this is the best deck in the history of time. For the past like 4 or 5 formats, everyone has been convinced there exists this like live twin Runick build of Sprite that's secretly the best deck in the room and yet has a consistent inability to put up anything resembling a coherent top. But I think its time is now. Couple of reasons. Firstly, Sprite massively did not benefit from the hand trap lineup that people were particularly playing to deal with Super Heavy Samurai. Cards like Droll and Lockbird and, for a short period of time, Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit are particularly damaging for this archetype. The ones that they'll be packing post are not. Second, it has an unbelievable ability to adapt. While I believe that Live Twin or Live Twin Runick will be far and away the most popular builds of this deck, there's nothing saying you can't just start putting the Melfi cards back in, go back to the way it was, or if people start cutting down on board breakers, you can play a balls to the wall combo list like the ones that were very popular pre-250th YCS that use like Rep Reducus to make totally awesome even with a lack of Ronin Totem. This deck has a lot of potential, a lot of flexibility, and in a more diverse format can definitely rise to the top. That's all the decks I feel confident putting in tier 1, but you know, that's already a 100% increase from the past one, so format saved. I'm not fucking around with that tier 1.5 bullshit anymore. I just really wanted to show off the Syac decks and thought they were a cut above everything below them, but a cut below Kashtira. Let's just go straight to 2. And the first deck in tier 2 is Labyrinth. Now, I think from this position, we are all pretty confident in saying that the dominant build of Labyrinth is probably going to be the IKEA one, the one that plays a ton of furniture and a minimal amount of traps main. Sure, some builds are on 3 copies of Skill Drain, but that is the only thing even resembling a Floodgate that exists in the list. Otherwise, it's basically trying to set up this, like, monster combo that gets you into a position where resolving something like a Welcome or a Big Welcome wins you the game on the spot because you go, like, +7. This deck didn't really receive any hits in the ban list, which might make you think that it would skyrocket to the top of tier 1, since previously it was like the 3rd or 4th best deck. But here's why I think that's not necessarily the case. IKEA Labyrinth was definitely a result of a very targeted string of hand traps being played. It was the combo deck that didn't lose to Droll and Lockbird. If the format is more diverse and we start going for more generic answers, it loses that advantage. What's more, the generic hand traps that people will start playing, things like Ash Blossom, kind of do eat this deck alive. Like, similar to Branded, that's the card it really doesn't want to see. And on that note, Branded. So I've talked about this a fair amount of times on stream, but I'll reiterate it here in case you're not watching my streams at twitch.tv/MBT-Yu-Gi-Oh! It's hard to tell if Branded got less powerful as a result of the ban list. Some of these decks like Kashtira, it's like a really easy sell, like, oh, it had 3 unicorn, now it loses a unicorn, so it's here, instead of here. But Branded didn't operate on that axis. Branded had one game plan: resolve Branded Fusion, get Branded Lost activations, set up an insane board with stuff like Quem, and then a second secret game plan. And that game plan was flip Branded Expulsion and win the game on the spot because you have a gimmick puppet in the graveyard. This game plan is still completely accessible. Theoretically, you can maybe get to this game plan with like Sanctifier, but it's a lot more difficult and labor intensive to do so. It's not the free win that it was the previous format. So if we take this game plan away, the deck has become less flexible, but not necessarily less powerful. Like, the ceiling is still there. That said, a deck becoming less flexible means it is less well positioned in this format. And I think Branded is, unfortunately, not very well positioned. The cards are strong, the gameplay loop is strong. The thing that concerns me the most about Branded is that it's the deck that feels like it loses to sideboard hate the most. Sure, you can do something like Kaiju and Arise Heart, and I guess theoretically you could side like Royal Decree if you're that fearful of Labyrinth, but most of the decks above it have the ability to pivot through targeted negation or hate for the strategy. Branded doesn't. The cards that beat Branded beat it into the sun. Dimensional Barrier, Eradicator Epidemic Virus, or Anti-Spell Fragrance. Ash. And as a result, if this deck ever has to play a game 2 or 3, I feel like you start on the back foot, which is really not where you want to be for a deck that is going to have to win at least some game 2s or game 3s. Next up is Super Heavy Samurai. So this deck lost a lot on the ban list. It lost the ability to do a significant amount of its one-card combos by going into Scarecrow and then reborning a copy of Soul Piercer over and over again until it drew 15 cards, and then Pendulum Summoning them all out and making an unbreakable board. But it didn't lose Wakaushi, which is still a one-card combo and still accessible off of Bike, and for that reason is still probably going to be a force in the upcoming metagame. While its combos are a little more intensive than they used to be, I think there are a couple of reasons you can be optimistic about this deck. Firstly, a lot of people were playing a hand trap lineup specifically to counter it in the previous format. Everyone was on Droll, some people were on Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, and you can guess what that's for. Less of those means more of a chance that you can just fire off Wakaushi willy-nilly. Secondly, it's the deck that can go the biggest. If you look at a lot of the other decks on this list, they play pretty close to the ground. They set up powerful but repeatable, recursive, defensive boards. This is the deck that just puts all of its cards on the table and says, do you have the out? And if it's the only deck that's doing that, things like sideboard options are probably going to be a lot less powerful than they would be otherwise. I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful for this deck, even post Scarecrow ban. Next up is Versus. All right, I am at least a little bit capping for clicks. So everyone please go to the comments and type, "Wow, Joseph, I can't believe you think Versus is the 6th best deck. I'm going to subscribe now and invest and comment." You're already commenting. It doesn't make sense to throw that in there. The TMT for this might or might not be out by the time that this video goes up, but this deck is fine. It's got a really powerful, consistent gameplay loop. Like a lot of the other decks on this list, it plays close to the ground. I'm just not really convinced that it has teeth relative to something like Sprite. I hate to be like the anti-OCG Andy, but the thing that is holding me back from calling this like a tier 1 competitive archetype is the lack of Maxi. Its main guy, Caesar Valius, really pops off if you have an Earth, a Fire, and a Dark monster in your hand. And while the archetype does facilitate ways to get all of those attributes into your grip, it really helps if you can also count on some hand traps to pull the rest of the weight. That's a lot easier when you have an obvious Fire target like Ash Blossom and an obvious Earth target like Maxi. You can still play like Bell, but the power of Bell relative to the power of Maxi is pretty ridiculous. I don't want people to come away thinking that this deck is unplayable because Maxi isn't a force in the TCG. This deck is really, really close to being really, really good. But the margins on this thing are so close that just by losing one tool, I feel like I am probably putting this in tier 2. Tier 3. Joshua Schmidt, turn off the video now. Mathmech in tier 3.
It's all freaking Mathmech. Why is it all Mathmech?
This deck's fine. And if you want my honest opinion about Mathmech for the first week of the new format, might as well end up here. But at this point, it's a known quantity. This deck's really weird in that I don't think it actually lost too much from the hit. I know putting Circular from 3 to 1 sounds like it's absolutely crazy and no longer playable, but the deck has like a million ways to get to Circular. Obviously, you have Small World and Cynet Mining, but also your mainline combo searches it by way of Alimbertion. And if you're playing the Firewall Defensor stuff, you can get to it from that normal summon super easily, go into Terahertz and powerful back row, like Super Factorial. There's even an argument that things got a little better for Mathmech, even with one Circular. Like, if people stop playing Droll, then this deck is going to really appreciate that. If people stop playing Kaijus because Pearly isn't as prevalent, it can safely go into Terahertz and activate its ability twice instead of putting all of your resources into one place and then it immediately dies. That said, I still think it's possible people do play Droll because a lot of the other decks on this list lose to it, and people do play Kaijus because a Rise Heart is still legal. So who knows? I think the fact that this deck is just sort of inflexible in so far as what it actually gets to do means that it's not going to get much farther than a couple of really impressive tops at the beginning of the format and then an immediate fall off. Oh yeah, and if anyone even looks at Abystial, this deck is unplayable. Next up in Tier 3, I have a deck that I did not think I would be putting here, but Gold Pride Punk. This is a weird position to be in. This deck's game plan is pretty much entirely known at this point. It's functionally solved. I don't think there's really very many ways to improve on the deck, except by maybe playing 60 cards, which some people did at Philly. And yet it is putting up results, like pretty consistently too. Like at every event, there's like maybe a copy of Gold Pride Punk. I don't know what's happening. I think the deck's got an insanely low ceiling, but I can't argue that it doesn't have a type of interaction that decks really aren't capable of playing around in Rollerballer. Start Your Engines is also the funniest custom card of all time. And you can decide to supplement the low ceiling of this deck with a bunch of really powerful cards like the Adventure Engine, which some people were doing at Philly, at the cost of being able to play defensive options like hand traps and board breakers. But it's at least a little bit customizable. A little surprised to see this deck doing well, but it's a welcome surprise. Next up, Sword Soul. Sword Soul's in a weird position. It's good. Like, it's a good deck. It's, okay, you're spamming the copy pasta. I get it. We're just spamming the copy pasta now. It's put up a number of decent results recently, including a really impressive finish at Philadelphia. That said, I don't think it's, like, great. It does what it does, and it does it extremely well. This deck is unmatched in terms of normal summoning Moye, revealing a card in hand, going into Chi-Xiao, searching Blackout, and then maybe long wanting afterwards. It's the best deck in the game at doing that, but sometimes Moye, Target, and 3 hand traps isn't enough to actually win a game, especially when the ceilings of the other decks in the format are high. I think as the format diversifies, their linear game plan is going to be massively rewarded for being so adaptable and hitting everything pretty equally. But the targeted portion of their deck, the hand traps they're playing and the like, are going to be a lot less effective. If this deck is the best deck in the format at drawing 3 hand traps and then just doing the combo, and those 3 hand traps don't necessarily hit every deck, suddenly it gets a little less good. I know a lot of people are going to look at this deck and think, oh my god, Danglong is legal. This is the deck that could theoretically play Danglong, right? And, maybe. The thing about Danglong is, I don't actually think it's that good. I spent forever preaching that this card was like the second coming and incredibly powerful and definitely going to ruin Yu-Gi-Oh! Forever if it ever got unbanned, and then we did the Masochist Banlist tournament like 4 or 5 times, and it turned out, it's just kind of mid. It is definitely an option for Sword Soul decks that will enable it to access a combo style of gameplay and maybe some funny numbered synchro monsters, but at the cost of playing like maybe some Garnets in the deck and like shoveling the extra full of kind of mid options that you occasionally go into. I think the number one reason to play Sword Soul is that its linear game plan is so good, so consistent, and can draw 3 cards that are not engine and still win. I think making it some sort of combo strategy just isn't really conducive to what the deck wants to do to compete in the modern era. And if you need any evidence for that, they already have a card that enables a ton of really crazy combo setups that they just don't play. It's called Ringo Worm. All right, next up, Marincess. Marincess keeps topping. I don't know how this is happening, really. Marincess is very well positioned relative to the power level of its cards. It's got a simple and repeatable setup that searches a type of interaction that's kind of difficult to deal with. Infinite Impermanence was really good last format, and this deck gets to play it while keeping monsters on field. It's also got a ton of ways to beat back really powerful going second spell cards in Aqua Argonaut games 2 and 3. It has the ability to draw into powerful non-engine with Bubble Reef. It has the ability to select which pieces of non-engine it wants to be playing because it has so many slots to do so, and it even has the power to supplement its linear game plan with some defensive options, maybe by doing the June Moon into Torrent line that people are at least experimenting with. The problem with this deck is twofold. First, it's got a pretty low ceiling. Everything it does is really telegraphed, and for that reason, it doesn't really have the adaptability necessary to make huge, powerful board states. You're basically just ending on one really difficult to remove guy. And the second is that there are ways to remove that guy. Kaijus are probably going to become a lot less popular in the wake of Pearly kind of dropping off the face of the earth, but I still expect to see a significant amount of them in sideboards due to the prevalence of a Rise Heart. That doesn't bode well for it. And finally, Dragon Link. So I've heard rumblings that we might be in a Bestial format. It's not hard to see why. If Sprite is a top tier deck, there's targets in there. The Bestials are pretty good against a lot of the IKEA Labyrinth setups. Branded, of course, has targets for it. Kashtira, maybe not so much, but one bad matchup isn't too bad. And God forbid if Mathmech was good. I think Dragon Link was close to playable last format, and I think that might be the necessary inclusion that would push it over the edge. It's shocking that this deck got like a whole bunch of new stuff in the new synchros, but still wasn't able to convert. I don't know. I'm willing to be wrong on this twice in a row. I just sort of assume every new format that Dragon Link is going to be playable. And now let's talk about garbage decks. Sorry, high potential strategies. Top of the pack, we've got Pearly. Lo, how the mighty have fallen. Now, I do think that reports of Pearly's death have been largely exaggerated. This deck has gotten a top with one Delicious Memory, but I can't deny that the inability to find Delicious Memory consistently does mean that this deck has really taken a kick in the teeth. For now, it's probably just worth waiting until Dune, at which point it'll be exceptionally playable once again, but I guess you can force it if you want. Speaking of decks you can force if you're coping, Tierlament. No, you guys don't understand. There's going to be less Kashtira around. It's Tierlament's time to shine. Less macros, less shifters. It's all coming up tier. I don't know. This deck's been all right for the last several formats, but I'm not really willing to get it twisted anymore. Rika. If your name is exactly at Sunseed Jess, you can probably win with this strategy. I think this deck probably competes with Super Heavy Samurai for a deck that just puts out a whole bunch of nonsense and hopes that the opponent doesn't have the necessary tools to remove it. That's a good place to be, but if people are already boarding answers to that for Super Heavy Samurai, you're probably going to get caught in the crossfire. Unless you're Jess, who seems to have the mandate of heaven. Next up, Dinomorphia. So you might be surprised to see this on here. It did clear a number of decks at YCS Philly, and that was in the previous format. This deck's actually crazy. They got a new piece of support in Cyberstorm Access, and it's really good, and as a result, I think it probably warrants a second look at the archetype. I will say, however, this deck's power largely relies on the type of removal people are packing. If it's removal attached to monsters, well, that's great, because Rex resolves that problem. But if they're playing like spell removal, like if Sky Striker is around and you have to contend with Afterburners, yeah, this deck isn't doing much. And then, you know, we got Monadium. Synchro monsters. That's it. And that's how I see this format shaking out. Obviously, I'm a little less confident with this than I was with the previous one because we don't have weeks of tournament results we are pulling from. This is all predictive, and I'm open to being extremely wrong. I will now entertain questions as to why X archetype isn't on the list. Dino's not on here because Giant, Skyhawk, and Peeps need another week to lab the deck. Runick. I mean, Runick will probably be played as a part of Sprite, but like Runick Stun isn't going to be good now. Dark World. Dark World's a really cool deck because not only does it lose to pretty much everything that people board, it also randomly loses to itself sometimes. Draco Slayer. What the hell is a Draco Slayer? Striker. What did Striker get? Just the Engage? Striker could probably go in high potential. I just feel like no individual Striker card does as much as it needs to compete in a format where like Sprite and Kashtira are tier 1 options. And I think that the top performing Sky Striker decks of recent have really relied on powerful going second equalizers in order to make up the difference between the low power level of the cards within it and the cards that are available to other decks. And I think that those cards individually are kind of at an all-time unplayable. Also, it randomly loses to a lot of things that people are just playing anyway. Like the Bestials hose this deck, for instance. Fluonderies. God, I think Fluonderies is an exceptionally cool deck, and I think it would have what it takes if it had the ability to play a comprehensive non-engine package. I think that its inability to play cards that stop your opponent from comboing off means that it's going to be run over by other decks, even if it is still able to put out an M-Pen and pass every single turn. Trap Tricks. Trap Tricks is kind of like Labyrinth, but like way worse, right? Ninjas. Oh, Vlad's editing this one. So Vlad, you can just explain why your favorite deck is so bad.
Okay, so the deck sucks because I don't know, it's just bad. It was never really good.
Drytron, it has 2 orange light now. Oh yeah, that's what was keeping Drytron from being playable. The second orange light. Wait, do they have 2 orange light? Where the fuck did the second orange light come from? The ban list. Oh yeah. Okay, all of you who are asking about like Nouvelle or Madolce or Generator, what do you want me to say about them? I think they're like pretty poorly. They fucking suck. They're ass. Like 20 Generator players bubbled Philly. Fuck you. What did they bubble? Sign-ups?